Welcome, Twitter. We are now live. This is a course that is right here. So, in the third year backbone course, this is going to be very different from the other courses that we've been doing. But in the third year backbone course, we're going to look at some pragmatists and existentialists that complement the backbone course of decoding Zarathustra. And that's the course that we're in right now. Um, What we're going to do is we're going to play about 45 minutes of Jordan Peterson's Genesis lectures, and we're going to pause them at any time and have discussion. And we're going to be looking for um, anything worth talking about, which there's a ton worth talking about. He's going to bring clinical psychology lessons in. He's got Jungian mythological interpretation methods and narrative theology. So if we look at this again, actually, what we've been mostly doing on Twitter are this first year backbone course here, Introduction to Academic Philosophy, and we cherry pick essays and we talk about them. There's a lot of lecturing from me. There's a lot of just mostly focusing on making sure we understand the arguments and the battlefields and the different things that are going on. And then there's complementary courses where we do the exact same method, but we look into ethics or metaphysics or philosophy of religion or of mind or something like that. The second year backbone course is something called A Brief History. Well, it's looking narratively at the entire conversation of Western philosophy in a dramatic context. So we start with Thales and we go through and we get a second chance to, instead of shotgunning or picking out shots at different areas of philosophy, we're going to look at the entire thing and from start to finish. And the courses that complement that are more seminary type courses. So we read through Plato's dialogues, we meditate with Descartes, that type of thing. And so there's certainly a lot of lectures in there, but there's also a lot of group discussion and wrestling with text together. In the third year, the backbone is this decoding Zarathustra, which is what we did last year on Twitter Spaces. I don't think it was recorded, so we'll be doing it again at some point. But we also complement that by looking at some other thinkers that are, some of them are the best students of Nietzsche in a sense. So we've got Jung and Peterson, we've got William James, and this is very different from the lectures that we've been doing. So I wanted to talk about that for a second and say the way that this course is going to work is we're going to play things, and the four people who are in this room, I know there's maybe a lot of people watching on Twitter, but the four people that are a part of this project, at any moment in the video, utter the word pause, and I will immediately pause the video and we will discuss anything that you think is relevant to discuss. There's tons of things to discuss. We may end up watching like 1 minute of the video and then discussing it for 45 minutes. We may watch 40 minutes of it and just have a few brief discussions, but that's basically the way it's going to go. And I don't feel the need to talk about anything else that we were going to talk about. So, with that introduction, this series is a part of the year 3 curriculum, and it's our introduction to Jordan Peterson. So let's get started. The audio's good, yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Welcome, Alana.
Okay, well, I thought this time that I would actually cover some of the biblical stories. So, and hopefully a number of them.
Sorry, is this not the first video? My bad. Oh, forgive me. Give me a second. Let's start with the beginning here. I thought this was the first one. Let's see if we can find this. Maps of meaning. Okay, I'm sorry. We're going to start with this one.
It's like it takes a lot of training. And
I failed all of my classes in high school and ended up dropping
Okay,
out.
here we go. The rule, Elena, is utter pause at any moment, and we're going to stop the video and discuss.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really shocking to me that you don't have anything better to do on a Tuesday night. No, seriously though, it is. I mean, you know, it's very strange in some sense that there's so many of you here to listen to a sequence of lectures on the psychological significance of the biblical stories. It isn't something I've wanted to do for a long time, but it still does surprise me that there's a ready audience for it. And well, so that's good. So we'll see how it goes. And I'll start with this because this is the right question. The right question is, why bother doing this? And I don't mean why should I bother doing it. I have my own reasons for doing it, but you might think, well, why bother with this strange old book at all? And that's a good question, you know. It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. You know, it's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's really interesting, you know, that something in some sense so evanescent can be so long-living. So there's that. That's kind of a mystery. I'm approaching this whole scenario, the biblical stories, as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. And then on top of all that, there's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. But I'm going to do my best, and partly because I want to learn more about them. And one of the things I've learned is that the best way to learn about something is to talk about it. And when I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, you know, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case. I'm trying to make sense out of this, and I have been doing this for a long time. Now, you know, you may not, that I'm an admirer of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a devastating critic of, I would say, dogmatic Christianity as it was instantiated in institutions, I suppose, although he's a very paradoxical thinker, because, for example, one of the things Nietzsche said was that he didn't believe that the scientific revolution would have ever got off the ground if it hadn't been for Christianity, and more specifically for Catholicism, because he believed that over the course of really 1,000 years, the European mind, so to speak, had to train itself to interpret everything that was known within a single coherent framework. Coherent if you accept the initial axioms. A single coherent framework. And so Nietzsche believed that Catholicization of the phenomena of life and of history produced the kind of mind that was then capable of transcending its dogmatic foundations and then concentrating on something else, which in this particular case happened to be the natural world. And so Nietzsche believed that in some sense Christianity died at its own hand. It had spent a very long period of time trying to attune people to the necessity of the truth, you know, absent the corruption and all of that that's always part of any human endeavor. And then the truth, the spirit of the truth that was developed by Christianity turned on the roots of Christianity, and everyone woke up and said something like, or thought something like, well, how is it that we came to believe any of this? It's like waking up one day and noting that you really don't know why you put a Christmas tree up, but you've been doing it for a long time, and that's what people do. And you know, there are reasons that Christmas trees came about, but what would you say, the ritual lasts long after the reasons have been forgotten. So now Nietzsche, although he was a critic of Christianity and also a champion of its disciplinary capacity, because you see, the other thing that Nietzsche believed was that it was not possible to be free in some sense unless you had been a slave. And by that he meant that you don't go from childhood to full-fledged adult individuality. You go from childhood to a state of discipline, which you might think is akin to slavery, to self-imposed slavery. That would be the best scenario, where you have to discipline yourself to become something specific before you might be able to reattain the generality that you had as a child. And he believed that Christianity had played that role for Western civilization. But in the late 1800s, he announced that God was dead. And you often hear of that as something triumphant. But for Nietzsche, it wasn't, because he was too nuanced a thinker to be that simple-minded. See, Nietzsche understood that, and this is something I'm going to try to make clear, is that there's a very large amount that we don't know about the structure of experience, that we don't know about reality. And we have our articulated representations of the world. And then you could think of, outside of that, there are things we know absolutely nothing about. And there's a buffer between them. And those are things we sort of know something about. And we don't know them in an articulated way. Here's an example. Sometimes you're arguing with someone close to you, and they're in a bad mood, and they're being touchy and unreasonable, and you keep the conversation up, and maybe all of a sudden they get angry, or maybe they cry, and then when they cry, they figure out what they're angry about, and it has nothing to do with you, even though you might have been what precipitated the argument, and that's an interesting phenomenon as far as I'm concerned, because it means that people can know things at one level without being able to speak what they know at another. And so in some sense, the thoughts rise up from the body, and they do that in moods, and they do that in images, and they do that in actions. And we have all sorts of ways that we understand before we understand in a fully articulated manner. And so we have this articulated space that we can all discuss, and then outside of that, we have something that's more akin to a dream that we're embedded in, and it's an emotional dream that we're embedded in, and that's based, at least in part, on our actions, and I'll describe that later. And then outside of that is what we don't know anything about at all. And in that dream, that's where the mystics live, and that's where the artists live, and they're the mediators between the absolute unknown and the things we know for sure. And you see, what that means in some sense is what we know is established on a form of knowledge that we don't really understand, and that if those two things are out of sync, so you might say if our articulated knowledge is out of sync with our dream, then we become dissociated internally. We think things we don't act out, and we act out things we don't dream, and that produces a kind of sickness of the spirit, and that sickness of the spirit, its cure is something like an integrated system of belief and representation. And then people turn to things like ideologies, which I regard as parasites on an underlying religious substructure, to try to organize their thinking, and then that's a catastrophe. And that's what Nietzsche foresaw. You see, he knew that when we knocked the slats out of the base of Western civilization by destroying this representation, this God ideal, let's say, that we would destabilize and move back and forth violently between nihilism, let's say, and the extremes of ideology. He was particularly concerned about radical left ideology, and believed and predicted this in the late 1800s, which is really an absolute intellectual tour de force of staggering magnitude. Predicted that in the 20th century that hundreds of millions of people would die because of the replacement of these underlying dreamlike structures with this rational but deeply incorrect representation of the world. And we've been oscillating back and forth between left and right in some sense ever since, and with some good sprinkling of nihilism in there and despair. And in some sense, that's the situation of the modern Western person, and increasingly of people in general. I think part of the reason that Islam has its backup with regards to the West to such a degree, there's many reasons, and not all of them are valid, that's for sure, but one of the reasons is that, they being still grounded in a dream, let's say, they can see that the rootless
Sorry to interrupt in mid thought there. I just want to share this image again. Say, okay, this is what he's talking about, right? The way he's going to be approaching understanding the scriptures is that there's a grounding that's more fundamental than the thoughts we have within the scientific or the philosophic, right? The things that we have the ability to wrap our words around completely. Those might be the subject of epistemology and ethics and the conversations we can have philosophically, or the things we really understand in a sort of formulaic way where we can build a spaceship to the moon or an iPad or something, our physics, our chemistry, those sorts of things. He's saying these are like pillars where imagine humanity is just lost in a forest. But if you clear away enough of the forest, you can get some grounding and you can start to build structures. And those structures are very familiar to you because they're very simplified, and you know the borders and you know the lines and you know the streets and you know the walls. That's within the well-developed scientific. And you can only do that if you do the philosophical work of clearing away the jungle and getting a clear understanding of where you're walking on that ground. But outside that is this broader realm where the only way you can really talk about truth out there is in a dreamlike way, because it's not something that's been cleared out where you've got um where you've got enough familiarity with, where you can actually talk about it with a kind of a confidence that says, I know what these words mean within the framework of the limitation of how they've been defined and we've agreed to use them. And so this Nietzschean point that he's making here is that we live in this scientism kind of age. We live in an age, as Peterson's talking about, where we're vacillating between political and religious ideologies and nihilism and feeling like everything's meaningless. And the reason why is not that our science failed or our philosophy failed. It's that we've lost touch with the ultimate grounding upon which these things are built. So when he says it's the realm of image, we're talking about orchestral, non-lyrical music. We're talking about painting. We're talking about figures and characters. We're talking about narrative. And we're talking about architecture, which says, you walk into the cathedral or into the castle, and it's like everything around you is designed to shout out at you. You exist in relationship to the cosmos or to the divine in this sort of a way, right? So he's setting the stage this way because his understanding of how to understand the scriptures is going to be in this sort of deeper, more profound sort of a way. And this is also worth mentioning, that why he's one of the reasons why he's talking about this, or rather, he'll use the phrase often, um, it means at least this much, right? So, in other words, there's a humility to approaching the scriptural narratives that he uses consistently throughout all of this, where he says, okay, I'm going to feel my way through the dark jungle here. I've got a guide, I've got a lamp, I've got a light. But when I try to take it back to you and tell you what the verse means, it doesn't mean exactly what I just said, because what I just said is using propositional language as if I've got my mind wrapped around it, and I don't. It's not that kind of thing. So instead, he'll often use this phrase. It's, you pay attention, it's in there all the time, where he says, "Oh, the story is telling us that there's a divine and we're in relationship to it this way, and that there's the spirit of Cain." And he says, and when he's done, he'll say, it means at least that much, right? That's the humility, where he's saying, I'm not telling you that you could reduce the story to what I just said, and then you don't need to read the story anymore because, hey, I turned it into some formulas. He's saying, no, we're in this realm out here on the edges where if we're not rooted and we're not grounded out there, all of our science won't know what to aim at. All of our philosophy could go in almost any direction, right? Like we need that solid grounding. Anyway, let me share the right video again and we'll go on. But I thought it's nice to notice what he means by this in his approach. I know he's going to spend quite a lot of time before he gets to the first verse, but I wanted to highlight that.
Questioning mind of the West poses a tremendous danger to the integrity of their culture. Now, and it does. I mean, Westerners, us, we undermine ourselves all the time with our searching intellect, and I'm not complaining about that. I mean, there isn't anything easy that can be done about it, but it's still a sort of, well, fruitful catastrophe. And you know, it has real effects on people's lives. It's not some abstract thing, you know. I mean, lots of times when I've been treating people for depression, for example, or anxiety, they have existential issues, you know. It's not just some psychiatric condition. It's not just that they're tapped off of normal because their brain chemistry is faulty, although, you know, sometimes that happens to be the case. It's that they are overwhelmed by the suffering and complexity of their life, and they're not sure why it's reasonable to continue with it. You know, they can feel the terrible negative meanings of life, but are skeptical beyond belief about any of the positive meanings. I had one client who was a very brilliant artist, and as long as he didn't think, he was fine, you know, because he'd go and create, and he was really good at being an artist. He just, you know, he had that personality that was continually creative and quite brilliant, although he was self-denigrating. But as soon as he started to think about what he was doing, then, you know, it's like a drill or a thaw or something like that. He'd saw the branch off that he was sitting on, because he'd start to criticize what he was doing, even the utility of it, even though it was sort of self-evidently useful. And then it would be very, very hard for him to even motivate himself to create. And he always struck me as a good example of the consequences of having your rational intellect divorced in some way from your being, divorced enough so that it actually questions the utility of your being. And it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. And it's really not a good thing, because it manifests itself not only in individual psychopathology, but also in social psychopathology. And that's this proclivity of people to get tangled up in ideologies, which I really do think of as they're like crippled religions. That's the right way to think about them. They're like a religion that's missing an arm and a leg, but can still hobble along. And it provides a certain amount of security and group identity, but it's warped and twisted and demented and bent, and it's a parasite on something underlying that's rich and true. And that's how it looks to me anyways. And so I think it's very important that we sort out this problem. I think that there isn't anything more important that needs to be done than that. I've thought that for a long, long time, probably since the early 80s, when I started looking at the role that belief systems played in regulating psychological and social health. Because you can tell that they do that because of how upset people get if you challenge their belief systems. It's like, why the hell do they care exactly? What difference does it make if all of your ideological axioms are 100% correct? Like, people get unbelievably upset when you poke them in the axioms, so to speak. And it is not by any stretch of the imagination obvious why, you know. But it's like there's a fundamental truth that they're standing on. It's like they're on a raft in the middle of the ocean, and you're starting to pull out the logs, you know, and they're afraid they're going to fall in and drown. It's like, drown in what? And what are the logs protecting them from? And why are they so afraid to move beyond the confines of the ideological system? And these are not obvious things. So I've been trying to puzzle that out for a very long time, and I've done some lectures about that are on YouTube. Most of you know that. And some of what I'm going to talk about in this series, you'll have heard if you've listened to the YouTube videos. But, you know, I'm trying to hit it from different angles. And so, okay, so Nietzsche's idea was that human beings were going to have to create their own values, essentially. Now, he understood that we had bodies and that we had motivations and emotions. Like, he was a romantic thinker in some sense, but way ahead of his time, because he knew that our capacity to think wasn't some free-floating soul, but was embedded in our physiology, constrained by our emotions, shaped by our motivations, shaped by our body. He understood that, but he still believed that the only possible way out of the problem would be for human beings themselves to become something akin to God and to create their own values. And he thought that he talked about the person who could create their own values as the overman or the superman. And that was one of the parts of Nietzschean philosophy that the Nazis, I would say, took out of context and used to fuel their, you know, superior man ideology. So, and we know what happened with that. That didn't seem to turn out very well, that's for sure. And see, I also spent a lot
Can you hear me? I don't know if I was on mute. I said, let's pause for a quick second here. He's
Okay.
absolutely 100% correct in his idea that Nietzsche thought that the solution was going to be for man to uh, create new values. However, um, Nietzsche didn't think that was easy. In fact, his positing of the Übermensch was basically saying humanity isn't up to the task. And if when we do our Decoding Zarathustra course, he has a passage called On the Way of the Creator, where he says, okay, what this costs is everything. It's a death and a rebirth that's necessary. And there's a way of understanding, again, I think he's right. And Peterson is right to say that Nietzsche thought that humanity itself was going to have to find and rescue infinite significance and then put that on the stamp of the type of thing we are, which is, as Descartes said, living in the mean between infinite being and utter chaos, and or potentiality or non-being. So he thought from our Dionysian middle ground that we were going to have to rescue what it was that we lost when God died. That's not incorrect. However, he also clearly didn't think we were up to the task. And then he thought he could accomplish it. So there's a way of understanding that his Zarathustra is the one who does that thing. And by doing it in the third section of the book, he's doing what other people can't do. And then that will redeem the past and give meaning to the future. And then he will be the creator that pushes on the future like a firm hand on gentle wax, like he saw himself as a destiny and accomplishing that thing. So it's not wrong to say that he thought that there would have to be a solution from the human perspective on the problem. However, Nietzsche is also not saying everybody can just easily go make up their own values and then that'll solve the problem. I don't think Peterson's suggesting that that's what he's saying, but a lot of people interpret Nietzsche to be saying that. And it's extremely clear that he's not saying anything like that. He's saying, you don't have the ability to do this. So let me posit something beyond man. That's what the Overman or the Übermensch meant. It didn't mean, hey, read my books and you're the Ubermensch. It meant read my books to realize that you're not going to be able to do something like this. The problem is too difficult for humanity. We won't go any more into Nietzsche than that right now, but Peterson's a careful reader of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche has had a massive effect on, we're going to be looking at William James and Jung, and Peterson's clearly been influenced by both of those. We could consider those the three best students of Nietzsche, perhaps to date. But anyway, I thought it'd be worth mentioning, and those of you who've seen the Decoding Zarathustra thing can follow along pretty well with that. Let me hit play again.
A lot of time reading Carl Jung, and it was through Jung and also Jean Piaget, who's a developmental psychologist, that I started to understand that our articulated systems of thought are embedded in something like a dream, and that dream is informed in a complex way by the way we act. So, we act out things we don't understand all the time. And if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't need a psychology or a sociology or an anthropology or any of that, because we would be completely transparent to ourselves. And we're clearly not. So we're much more complicated than we understand, which means that the way that we behave contains way more information than we know. And part of the dream that surrounds our articulated knowledge has been extracted as a consequence of us watching each other behave and telling stories about it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, extracting out.
I'm so sorry to interrupt there, but on the Nietzsche point again, really quickly, another thing to notice that's worth noticing is that after he says all of that, Nietzsche hints in one passage quite strongly at the idea that now that this has been accomplished, one day someone might have to resurrect that old God again. So the amount of difficulty in actually understanding Nietzsche and how easily he allowed himself on purpose by design to be misunderstood by everybody and to be annexed therefore into every possible group. If you go to an academic library at a university, you pay $100, they just give you access for a year. And you go to the philosophy section, there's whole rows of shelves of books all about Nietzsche. And every one of them, you could just look at the titles, is Nietzsche as postmodernist, Nietzsche as Christian, Nietzsche as this, Nietzsche as that. and Nietzsche as Nazi, right? It's like everybody can pretend that Nietzsche's in their group because he's a 1 in 10 billion genius, and so they'd like him in their group. But the reason why that's so easy to do is that he encoded what he was saying so that it would be misunderstood by people who who weren't. He was doing a parable type thing. It's very similar to what um, Socrates hints that he was doing something else besides the philosophy he was doing, and that was sort of the background thing he was up to. And Christ is talking in parables to allow the truth to be expressed. And Nietzsche was consciously aware that he was trying to do something like that, which helps to explain why he can be so easily misunderstood. But for those of you who are Christian and who, one of the things to highlight here is how much Nietzsche agrees and really diagnoses what the problem is, right? He says someday someone might have to resurrect that God. That's not my job, right? He wants nothing to do with that job, but he certainly left open the space for it. So for those of you who are a Christian and are still puzzling over why Jordan Peterson's interested in Genesis and all he's doing is talking about Nietzsche, the understanding of the problem that we have today, Nietzsche understood it. He spelled it out for us. Uh, Peterson agrees that there's a lot there to go. The amount of agreement that Nietzsche has with the deep, profound mythopoetic approach to what it means to be in the world and what the problems are for how we are to navigate it, and the agreement that if we don't have infinite significance, we cannot justify being, right? So the Christians are saying, well, God, he's that thing, and we're aimed at that. And Socrates says the arche, the source of truth, beauty, justice, goodness, love. Let's aim at that. It's real. Nietzsche said, okay, maybe it was, maybe it is, but what we've done intellectually is murder it. And now that we've murdered it, we're in a lot of trouble, right? So when Peterson's saying, hey, he predicted that we were going to be violently vacillating between radical ideologies and nihilism and a sense of meaninglessness, Nietzsche said, I will give you the history of the next 200 years. That's what's going to happen. And so if you think that that's an accurate diagnosis of where we're at, Nietzsche was spelling out the problem and trying to find a solution. We won't judge whether or not he got it right or not, but to help explain why Peterson is so interested in Nietzsche, it's that Nietzsche is talking about all of this, and the amount of agreement he has with the ancient prophetic tradition is really profound. So we'll stop making that comment.
Out patterns of behavior that characterize humanity and trying to represent them partly through imitation, but also through drama and mythology and literature and art and all of that to represent what we're like so that we can understand what we're like. And that process of understanding is what I see unfolding, at least in part, in the biblical stories. And it's halting and partial and awkward and contradictory and all of that, which is one of the things that makes the book so complex. But I see in it the struggle of humanity to rise above its animal forebears, say, and to become conscious of what it means to be human. And that's a very difficult thing because we don't know who we are, what we are, where we came from, or any of those things. And, you know, the life is an unbroken chain going back 3.5 billion years. It's an absolutely unbelievable thing. Every single one of your ancestors reproduced successfully for 3.5 billion years. It's absolutely unbelievable. We rose out of the dirt and the muck, and here we are, conscious but not knowing, and we're trying to figure out who we are. And a story that we've been telling, or a set of stories that we've been telling for 3,000 years, seems to me to have something to offer. And so when I look at the stories in the Bible, I do it, I would say, in some sense, with a beginner's mind. It's a mystery, this book, how the hell it was made, why we preserved it, how it happened to motivate an entire culture for 2,000 years and to transform the world. Like, what's going on? How did that happen? It's by no means obvious. And one of the things that bothers me about casual critics of religion is that they don't take the phenomena seriously. And it's a serious phenomena. I mean, not least because people have the capacity for religious experience and no one knows why that is. And I mean, you can induce it reliably in all sorts of different ways. You can do it with brain stimulation. You can certainly do it with drugs. There's especially the psychedelic variety. They produce intimations of the divine extraordinarily regularly. People have been using drugs like that for God only knows how long, 50,000 years, maybe more than that, to produce some sort of intimate union with the divine. It's like, We don't understand any of that when we discovered the psychedelics in the late 60s. It shocked everybody so badly that they were instantly made illegal and abandoned in terms of research for like 50 years. And it's no wonder, because who the hell expected that? Nobody. Now, Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, at a very astute.
Okay, we've decided we're only going to watch 45 minutes of this, so we've only got about 5 minutes left to discuss. And man, is Peterson powerful and poetic. I just wanted to shout amen and yes to a lot of the stuff he was just saying there at the end. And this is, he's going to get into some heavy things, and he's just doing the introduction right now. But so one of the ways of understanding the situation that we're in right now is if you imagine that outer realm, which is the one he wants to go into. It's the one Jung wanted to go into. He wanted to go and explore really far out into the chaos and somehow have the ability to navigate that, maybe with a lifeline or something. But there's an inclination not to do that, and there's good reason. It's related to what Peterson was talking about when he was saying, "Hey, if you poke people in their axioms, they suddenly get very, very upset." You've noticed that before, right? Like I had a conversation this week with a scientism lover and an atheist on Twitter, and it's like if you just make the most gentle invitation to question um, how well. So first of all, we live in this age where it's like I defend science and you're a science denier. And there's all these sorts of people who want to say, it's like, wait, you're on a pillar in the middle of this thing. And you're not using, there's nothing in your microscope that made you think that it was ethical and virtuous to be such a defender of science. You're talking in mythopoetic narrative language, right? And so when you poke people at the idea that say, well, just gently consider the idea that nothing in your microscope told you or your telescope told you that this whole narrative surrounding your approach to formulaic descriptions of things really is the ultimate truth. They don't respond with, "Oh, that's very interesting. Let me consider that." They respond with, "Wait a minute. I was living in this tiny little cult-like church where I had all my beliefs and everything was defined, and now an earthquake is coming." They respond as if like, "Oh my God, something horribly evil is happening to me." And then they hallucinate that you said something bad to them when you didn't. They literally in real time, you can just watch them do it. It's very similar when you go to like a church of people who think they've got sort of they understand everything and you start asking some questions, they feel uncomfortable in a way that's different from, "Oh, I thought I was right about that, but let me see, maybe you have a point." They feel like, "Oh my God, the whole world is about to fall apart." Okay. So what's happening? Well, what Nietzsche said is we've made a new Christian sect called scientism. He didn't use these words, but essentially the idea was our science worship is just a Christian invention. And it's an invention that killed God. Not because science is the ultimate truth and we've now proven God doesn't exist, but because the way it approached truth forced us to no longer have any ability to um, recognize the divine. But he laughed at that. He mocked it. He's like, "You clearly are the most monotheistic religious people I've ever met in my life." Right? That was in one of his passages that we look at in Zarathustra. His mock of the new atheists and stuff was to call them way too Christian for his liking, which of course he was very good at smashing people in the type of insult that they would hate the most. But that was sort of what was at the core of the problem is that you are, whether you want to believe it or not, you are relying on this mythopoetic language to understand who you are in the world. You know why? Because you should. Because that's what you actually are. What you so a way of putting it quite simply is to say if I want to learn about what it means to be human, I could read a biology textbook. That might tell me something. I could read a geology textbook where creatures that live on a cooling planet with a turbulent weather system and circling. I could read a cosmology book or at least an astrophysics book. I could look at these things, but as much information as those might give me, if I want to know what it's like to be human, I could also go read King Lear. I could watch Pinocchio. I could, right? Like there's a different kind of language. And the language of narrative is not banishing the subjective. It's starting with the character and saying that there's a way of being in the world and there's ways of aiming at things and there's obstacles, and there's a way of understanding your relationship to nature and to the cosmos and to the divine and to each other as relational between characters and personalities. And it's not like you don't have all the evidence in the world that that's true. You as an individual have to run the experiment, but that means there's more experiments being run. But you run the experiment to say, yeah, it's like something to be in the world, and it speaks to me. This art speaks to me. The statues speak to me. When we do the second year, we really start out with this. We look at cave paintings and statues and things. It's like these things are shouting meaning at you that you couldn't possibly reduce to a a billion statements, let alone a few statements, right? There's a reason why we spend a lot of money driving and flying to museums to stand in front of a statue of David or of Venus and say, okay, that's a personality that's in the world that I have to relate to, that I embody or am possessed by sometimes, or could aspire to be. That type of language is for the Nietzscheans, for the existentialists, for like the Kierkegaardians and the William Jamesians. That's the pragmatists. That's, and for Jordan Peterson, that's completely appropriate and inescapably necessary. Even the people who say to themselves, "My story is that I believe science and only objective things," they don't, because they believe in the story that it's good to be that way of being. They're completely relying on perhaps a very cartoonish and childish and silly mythology, but they can't help the fact that they are that type of creature, and that that's the sort of language that actually speaks to them. So I know he's going to go through hours and hours of setting it up before he gets to Genesis 1:1, but there's a reason for that, which is that we all don't know any of these things, or at least we all sort of know them intuitively, but we all know that you're never supposed to say them, and we don't know how to speak about them. And so he's venturing forth to make, he one of the things that's very impressive about Peterson, and I saw this from the start, and it's really impressive, is that he's going to say, okay, if something shines with the truth, I'm going to go figure it out. But I'm going to give myself a second burden, which is that I know you can't talk about that in academia unless you meet certain standards. So I'm going to try to put it into the sort of words that are defendable academically. And he's doing that. I mean, Nietzsche, the fact that Nietzsche existed is sort of what made Jung and Peterson and a lot of these thoughts really possible in a lot of ways. But we're all children of Nietzsche, whether we know it or not, to some degree. And that's not to say he's right in his solution or anything, but in his diagnosis of the problem, it's not to say he's wrong in his solution either, by the way, but we're not looking at that. But in his diagnosis of the problem and in his way of understanding, it's like um, Peterson has to preface all of this before we even get into the Bible, because even Christians or spiritual, other spiritualists too, but we're looking at Genesis. So even Christians who meditate on the Bible and read the Bible, they will often read it in this era that we're in as if, well, it's objective scientific truth. That's what it means, because that's the ultimate kind of truth. Nietzsche's turning that upside down. He's making it possible for people like the pragmatists and the existentialists. Kierkegaard did the same work, but to say, no, wait a minute, there is nothing superior about that way of knowing. It's super helpful in certain realms. I mean, it's superior in that sense, but it's there's nothing ultimate about it. So by the reason why he has to do this is that, one, many religious people are approaching the scriptures with the same Dawkinite view, right? The Richard Dawkinite new atheists, they're saying, hey, the ultimate truth is the thing that banishes consideration of the subject, and it only makes formulaically describable bits of stuff what is real. Well, that's not what's real. That's not what's real to you. That's not what's real to me. That's not what it's like to be in the world. I can't tell you for sure what it's like to be anything else in the world, but the one thing I do know what it's like to be is nothing like that. And I actually presume continuity. I think what it's like to be, Nietzsche said, what it's like to be a flea is just like being the center of the universe. I think that's what it's like to be a proton or a star. I don't think they have complicated emotions. I'm not claiming anything like that, or complicated thoughts. But the idea is to say, okay, we're going to radically overturn this mistake, which we're identifying as a mistake, of saying the ultimate truth would be in objective language. And then we're going to realize, look, first of all, the people who claim that are claiming it in a mythopoetic, characterological kind of a way. They're looking for religion in their science. It's not a whatever, God bless them, but they're not escaping it. And they certainly aren't disproving it. So first of all, there are Christians who read the book and say, yeah, that's the ultimate truth. I'll read it that way. It's a science textbook. That might be missing the point. But then there are other Christians who understand meditating and maybe a little bit of the spirit of the prophetic and the shining of the truth, but they don't know how to defend that that could possibly be true or mean anything. And what Peterson's doing really magically and powerfully is he's saying, look, I'm going to go do that stuff, but I'm going to bring it back to the academic. I'm going to be able to talk about it in a way where you can't say, shut me up. No, you're going to be citing my papers when I talk about it this way. And that's a hell of a thing to accomplish. So, on that note, I'm going to shut up and leave it open for anybody else who wants anything to say. I'll wrap up again by saying this is a third-year course. It's very different from the lectures. It's very different from the first-year stuff, which is mostly what we're doing, which is reading essays and focusing on understanding what the writers are saying and understanding the field. It's also beyond the second year where we do a lot of seminar stuff. It's very much let's learn together, and let's so what we're going to do is the four of us who are doing this every weekend, we're going to just play about 45 minutes of Peterson's Genesis lectures, and any one of you just or any one of us says pause, we're going to pause the video and we're going to discuss insights in psychology, insights in Jungian interpretation methods, or insights into scriptural revelation. All three of those are appropriate, and he's got a foot in all three while he's doing these things. And so that's what we're going to do from now on for about 45 minutes on the weekends. So with that, tying a bow on this is our first get together. We're going to keep doing this. I'm going to shut up and we'll go around the room. If anybody has anything they'd like to say, any questions, any comments. I know we're just in the beginning of him introducing these big topics, but you can see why so much work needs to be done because of where we are in our understanding of how to think and who we are. And all of that could be very messed up, and so we're bringing this existentialist revolution to the whole thing to say, okay, what if we approached it differently? What if it was too profound to wrap our minds around and claim we have the full understanding of it? What if it's not trying to be objective? What if it's trying to talk to us as characters in the world? And what if that's a more profound and deeper way of talking to us, because that's what we actually are. So we'll pick up where we left off, and he's going to start with his Jungian points next. And there's a reason why he has to do the rearranging of the furniture and stuff. You can see how uh, most discussions aren't like this for now. In 200 years, all discussions will be like this because this is the destiny of the future. It's been accomplished. But for now, we're all still very lost on these sorts of things. So before you can even get to Genesis 1:1, I think there's like 3 hours of this setting the stage stuff. Anybody want to pop in here? I'll end the stream after, if not, and we'll just do a little after talk, and then we'll meet again next weekend to do another 40 or 45 minutes. Okay, thanks for showing up. I'm really excited about this new project, and I'm looking forward to getting into the the scriptures and the stories and all of that really fun stuff. So we'll see y'all on Twitter next week when we come back to do this again.